Okay, so you want to get a handle on this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, huh? You've brought some interesting stuff to the table.
Yeah,
Yeah, two YouTube videos, actually.
interesting.
One by Ben Shapiro
Oh, yeah.
and another one from War Stories.
Okay.
And that's great, I think,
Yeah.
because, seeing things from different perspectives is really key to understanding something that's this complex.
It really is. It's a conflict that's been going on for generations.
Yeah.
And to really understand it, you need to know the history,
Yeah,
the different claims to the same piece of land,
yeah.
and how religion, politics, and culture
Yeah.
are all intertwined.
So let's jump in.
Let's do it.
Ben Shapiro's video, I have to say, it really goes deep.
Oh, yeah.
He traces this connection that the Jewish people have to the land
Yeah.
all the way back to like 1300 BCE.
Wow.
And it's just packed with these details I never knew about.
Yeah, and it's remarkable how far back that history goes.
Yeah.
And for many people, this ancient connection
Yeah.
is really the heart of their claim to a Jewish homeland.
Yeah.
It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. I never knew. Like,
Yeah.
he talks about King David
Mm-hmm.
establishing Jerusalem as the capital
Right.
1,000 years before Christ. I mean, that's even older than Rome,
Yeah.
you know?
Crazy.
And then there's the first temple,
Yeah.
built even earlier,
Uh-huh.
1600 years before the rise of Islam.
Wow.
Like, it really puts things in perspective.
It puts things in perspective for sure.
When you think about it like that, you know?
Yeah, those events,
Yeah.
along with, the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles that scattered Jewish populations, they're really central to that idea of a Jewish homeland.
Yeah.
So even though they were dispersed,
Yeah.
that connection to the land remained a powerful force.
It's like woven into the very fabric of the
roots,
region.
yeah.
And then, of course, we have these powerful forces
Yeah.
that come in, Romans.
Right.
You know, Shapiro talks about their conquest in 63 BCE.
Yeah.
And the eventual destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE.
Right.
I mean, that feels like a pivotal moment.
It was absolutely pivotal. The destruction of the Second Temple was devastating for the Jewish people.
Yeah.
It really led to the Bar Kokhba revolt,
Right.
which was a desperate attempt
Yeah.
to regain their independence from Roman rule.
Yeah.
But the Romans crushed that rebellion.
Wow.
And they took it a step further
Hmm.
in a move designed to really sever the Jewish connection to the land.
Yeah.
They renamed the area Palestine
Oh, wow.
after the Philistines,
Right.
an ancient enemy of the Israelites.
It's incredible how a name can carry so much weight, you know?
It's true.
Becoming a tool to rewrite history,
Yeah.
assert dominance.
Yeah. And that renaming
Wow.
really marked the beginning of centuries of rule by different empires.
Oh, wow.
The Arab conquest in the 7th century,
Right.
followed by the Crusaders,
Yeah.
the Mamluks,
Right.
and finally the Ottomans,
Right.
who ruled from the 16th century all the way to the early 20th century.
And for centuries,
Yeah.
there was no independent Palestinian state.
There wasn't none.
That's a really interesting point because so much of the conversation today
Right.
focuses on this two-state solution,
Uh-huh.
but for this huge chunk of history,
Right.
this concept
Yeah.
of separate Israeli and Palestinian states didn't even exist.
It didn't exist.
It's amazing.
And even under Ottoman rule,
Right.
which technically prohibited Jewish land purchases,
Yeah.
some Jewish communities persisted
Right.
and found ways to acquire land,
Oh, wow.
which would later become a source of tension.
Right. So we're starting to see
Exactly.
how these layers sort of build upon each other,
They build on each other, yeah.
leading to the situation we have today.
Totally.
And speaking of building,
Yeah.
the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of Zionism, this movement advocating for a Jewish homeland.
Yeah. Zionism emerged as a response to growing anti-Semitism in Europe.
Right.
Theodor Herzl, a key figure in the movement,
Yeah.
he argued that Jews needed a safe haven, a
Yeah.
place where they could determine their own destiny.
Shapiro actually mentions that
Yeah.
Herzl himself wasn't particularly religious,
Oh, interesting.
but the Dreyfus affair in France
Right.
really galvanized him,
Yeah.
where that Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason.
Yeah.
He saw it as proof
Yeah.
that assimilation wouldn't protect Jews from persecution,
Right.
and that a Jewish state was essential for their survival.
Powerful.
It's interesting.
And Herzl's vision really resonated with many Jews at the time
Yeah.
who felt increasingly vulnerable in Europe.
Yeah.
And so this desire for a homeland coupled with increasing Jewish immigration to the region,
Right.
which is known as Aliyah,
Right.
really began to create friction with the Arab population,
Yeah.
who saw their own future in the land threatened.
It's like these two different visions
Yeah.
for the future of the same land,
Uh-huh.
both rooted in
Right.
history and identity,
Totally.
collide head on.
Yeah, and then you have the British
Oh, yeah.
entering the scene
Right.
with the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Right.
That was a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
The British government declared its support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine,
Right.
though the specific territory was left ambiguous.
That ambiguity is kind of a theme, isn't it?
Unfortunately, it is.
Yeah.
It set the stage for decades of conflict,
Yeah.
as both Jews and Arabs
Yeah.
felt that they had been promised the same land.
Right.
The British, attempting to appease both sides,
Right.
ended up fueling tensions and complicating the situation even further.
And to make matters worse,
Yeah.
the rise of Nazi Germany
Uh,
and the horrors of the Holocaust
right.
really intensified that urgency for a Jewish homeland.
It did.
You know, but then on the other hand, the British, trying to appease Arab concerns,
Right.
restricted Jewish immigration during a time when they desperately needed refuge.
Yeah, it was a tragic confluence of events.
Yeah.
You know, the Holocaust highlighted the vulnerability of the Jews in Europe.
Yeah.
And really reinforced the need for a safe haven.
Right.
But the British restrictions on immigration meant that many seeking escape were turned away. And it just added
Wow.
to the mounting pressure cooker.
And in the midst of all this, you have the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem,
Right.
a prominent Palestinian leader at the time,
Yes.
collaborating with Hitler during World War II.
Wow.
Shapiro even mentions
Yeah.
that the Mufti supported a final solution for the Jews
Oh, wow.
in the Holy Land if the Nazis were to conquer the region.
That's a dark chapter
It is.
in the conflict's history.
Yeah.
And it highlights the deep animosity
Yeah.
that existed even before the establishment of Israel. And you have to remember, this was a period of intense nationalism and ideological conflict globally, and the Middle East was caught in the crosshairs.
It's a stark reminder that this conflict isn't just about land,
It's not.
you know? It's about deeply held beliefs, historical grievances, and this struggle for survival and self-determination with the British Mandate nearing its end.
Right.
The stage was set for a dramatic showdown.
It really was. The situation was becoming increasingly untenable,
Yeah.
with tensions at a boiling point.
Right.
The world looked to the newly formed United Nations for a solution.
Right. And in 1947, the UN proposed the partition plan,
Right.
dividing the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state.
Yeah?
Shapiro highlights that the Jews, despite having reservations about the proposed borders, accepted the plan.
Okay.
But the Arabs
Yeah.
rejected it outright.
And the Arab rejection was rooted in several factors.
Yeah.
They saw the partition plan as an injustice,
Right.
arguing that they were being asked to give up land that had been theirs for centuries. They also had deep concerns about the feasibility of a Jewish state existing peacefully alongside an Arab state,
Right.
given the history of violence and mistrust.
So even with the UN trying to find this peaceful resolution,
Right.
the deep divisions and fears on both sides
Yeah.
were already making a peaceful outcome seem unlikely.
Yeah. And as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
those divisions would soon erupt into a full-blown conflict,
Yeah.
forever changing the landscape of the region.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Let's take a break.
Sounds good. So that rejection of the UN partition plan in 47, it didn't just create a political impasse.
Right.
It really underscored this profound mistrust and animosity that had been building for years.
Yeah.
The situation was incredibly volatile.
Yeah.
And as the British prepared to withdraw from their mandate,
Right.
the whole region was bracing itself.
Yeah. For the inevitable. And it didn't take long for those tensions to boil over.
No, it didn't.
On May 14th, 1948, Israel declared its independence.
Right.
And almost immediately,
Yeah.
5 neighboring Arab states launched a coordinated attack.
They did. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, also known as the War of Independence in Israel,
Right.
and al-Nakba, meaning the catastrophe in Arabic,
Right.
had a profound impact on the course of the conflict.
It did.
Israel, despite being vastly outnumbered,
Yeah.
managed to defend itself
Yeah.
and secure its existence.
Right.
But the war resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Palestinians.
Shapiro really emphasizes Israel's military victory,
Yeah.
portraying it as this triumph against all odds. But War Stories offers a completely different perspective,
Right.
focusing on the devastating impact on the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
They describe the fear, the chaos,
Right.
and the lasting trauma of losing their homes and becoming refugees.
It's important to remember that the 1948 war created these two conflicting narratives. One of victory and survival,
Right.
the other of loss and displacement.
Yeah.
And these narratives continue to shape how both sides view the conflict
Right.
and their claims to the land.
Yeah, it's clear that the war deepened the already existing divisions
Absolutely.
and hardened the resolve of both sides.
Yeah.
And even after the fighting subsided,
Right.
the conflict was far from over.
It was not.
The Arab League, still refusing to recognize Israel's legitimacy, doubled down on their rejection,
Yeah?
issuing the infamous 3 no's at their 1967 summit in Khartoum.
Right. Those 3 no's.
Yeah.
No peace with Israel.
Right.
No recognition of Israel.
Right.
And no negotiations with Israel.
Wow.
Really encapsulated the Arab world's stance at the time.
It's like more than a political disagreement.
It's more than that.
It's this complete refusal
Yeah.
to acknowledge Israel's right to exist.
Shapiro presents it as further proof of Arab hostility and intransigence. But War Stories argues that this stance was rooted in the trauma of the 1948 war
Right.
and the displacement of so many Palestinians.
Yeah.
They saw Israel as an illegitimate entity, a
Yeah.
product of colonialism and dispossession.
So it's crucial to understand the context behind those 3 no's.
Absolutely.
The Arab world felt betrayed by the international community, which they believed had sided with Israel and ignored their own claims and suffering.
Yeah, and this sense of betrayal and injustice
Yeah.
fueled their rejectionism.
It's a reminder that history is often written by the victors.
It is.
But understanding the perspectives of those who lost
Yeah,
is essential to grasping the complexity of this conflict.
absolutely.
And this period also saw the emergence of the Palestine Liberation Organization,
Right.
PLO, in 1964.
The PLO, founded by Yasser Arafat,
Right.
became the main representative body for the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
And they initially advocated for armed struggle against Israel,
Yeah.
aiming to liberate Palestine and establish a single state for all Palestinians.
Shapiro, of course, labels them a terrorist organization, focusing on their violent actions
Right.
and rejecting their claims of national liberation.
Yeah.
He describes incidents like the 1972 hijacking of Sabina Flight 571
Right.
by Palestinian terrorists,
Yeah.
reminding us of the human cost of this conflict.
It's true that the PLO engaged in acts of terrorism,
Yeah.
which undoubtedly caused suffering and loss of life.
Right.
But it's also essential to understand the context of their actions.
Right.
They saw themselves as fighting against a powerful and oppressive force,
Yeah.
and their tactics, while reprehensible,
Right.
were part of a broader struggle for freedom and self-determination.
So once again, we see these competing narratives,
Yes.
one of terrorism and the other of resistance. And as we move into the late 20th century, the conflict continues to escalate,
Yeah.
culminating in the 1967 Six-Day War.
Right. The Six-Day War was a watershed moment. Israel, fearing an imminent attack from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria,
Right.
launched a preemptive strike,
Oh.
achieving a stunning victory in just 6 days.
Yeah, it's almost unbelievable how quickly the map changed.
I know.
But, as Shapiro points out,
Yeah.
while Israel gained significant territory,
Yeah.
they also inherited a complex problem.
They did.
Control over a large Palestinian population in the newly occupied territories.
The occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip
Right.
created a new reality,
Right.
one that would become central to the ongoing conflict.
Yeah.
Israel now had to balance
Right.
its security concerns
Yeah.
with the aspirations of the Palestinian people,
Right.
who now lives under their control.
And as we'll see,
Yeah.
finding that balance would prove to be incredibly difficult,
Incredibly so.
leading to further violence, political maneuvering,
Yeah?
and a seemingly intractable stalemate.
The Six-Day War may have ended quickly,
Right.
but its consequences would reverberate for decades to come,
Wow.
shaping the political landscape
Right.
and creating new challenges for both Israelis and Palestinians.
Okay.
That 1967 war really shifted the landscape, didn't it?
Yeah.
Suddenly, Israel's in control of these territories
Right.
with a huge Palestinian population.
Yeah.
Raises all sorts of new questions.
Yeah. About land, security, the future
Absolutely.
of both peoples.
Yeah.
Shapiro really digs into the aftermath,
Oh, yeah.
talking about how that occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip
Right.
became this major point of contention.
It's important to understand that from the Palestinian perspective, this wasn't liberation.
Right.
This was occupation.
Right.
Their land was now controlled by another power.
Right.
And they had very limited autonomy
Right.
or control over their own lives.
Shapiro really focuses on those security challenges that Israel faced,
Right.
with groups like the PLO continuing to carry out attacks.
Right.
He seems to argue that Israel's control of the territories was necessary to protect its citizens.
And while Israel certainly had legitimate security concerns, War Stories points out that the occupation itself created resentment and fueled that resistance movement. They argue that living under military rule with checkpoints, restrictions on movement, limited economic opportunities, it created this pressure cooker that was bound to explode.
And explode. It did.
It did.
In the late 1980s with the first Intifada.
Yes.
A Palestinian uprising that lasted for years.
Right.
And this wasn't just about, organized groups like the PLO. It involved everyday people protesting against the occupation.
And that first Intifada really shifted international perception of the conflict. Images of Palestinian children throwing stones at Israeli soldiers became symbolic of that struggle. It forced the world to acknowledge the human cost of the occupation and the Palestinian desire for self-determination.
It seems like every attempt to resolve the conflict just leads to more complexity.
It does.
Like take the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, for example.
Yeah, this was supposed to be a breakthrough.
Right.
Israel recognizing the PLO. The PLO renouncing terrorism. Recognizing Israel's right to exist.
It was a big deal.
It was a big deal.
But
the Oslo Accords were definitely a turning point. They offered this glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution. A two-state solution. Where Israelis and Palestinians could live side by side. In their own independent states.
But Shapiro argues that the PLO never truly intended to honor the agreement, pointing to continued acts of violence and incitement. But War Stories claims that Israel's continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank undermined trust and made a viable Palestinian state increasingly difficult to imagine.
And the Oslo Accords, while groundbreaking, ultimately failed to deliver lasting peace. They were vague on key issues, like the final status of Jerusalem and the fate of Israeli settlements, which created a lot of room for interpretation and mistrust.
And then in 2000, the second Intifada erupted.
It did.
A much more violent uprising than the first. This one involved suicide bombings and targeted assassinations.
A brutal escalation that left thousands dead on both sides.
It's like a cycle of violence.
It is.
Just keeps spinning. Each act of aggression feeding the next.
The second Intifada, fueled by anger and frustration over the failure of the peace process and the continued occupation, marked another tragic chapter in the conflict.
And then you have the rise of Hamas, an Islamist group that took control of the Gaza Strip after Israel withdrew in 2005.
Hamas's emergence as a major force in Palestinian politics further complicated the landscape. They rejected the Oslo Accords. And continued to call for Israel's destruction. Launching rockets into Israeli territory.
Shapiro portrays Hamas as this purely terrorist organization bent on destroying Israel and sacrificing the well-being of the Palestinian people for their ideological goals.
He points to their use of human shields and their investment in weapons over infrastructure. But War Stories highlights the desperation and the anger that fuels support for Hamas in Gaza. They argue that years of blockade and isolation, coupled with Israel's military operations, have created a humanitarian crisis and fostered extremism.
It seems like no matter what steps are taken, the violence continues.
It does.
Israel developed the Iron Dome missile defense system to intercept rockets from Gaza. But that doesn't address the underlying issues.
It doesn't,
fueling the conflict. Technology can provide a shield. But it can't solve the deeply rooted political and emotional dimensions of this conflict. It requires addressing those core issues
Yeah.
of land security, identity, and justice.
And then there's the Abraham Accords, brokered by the Trump administration in 2020.
Yes.
Which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states.
Yes, including the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain.
Right.
The Abraham Accords marked a significant shift in regional dynamics.
Yeah?
Some saw it as a sign that that old paradigm of Arab-Israeli conflict was fading,
Right.
replaced by a new alignment
Yeah.
based on shared interests, particularly countering Iran's regional ambitions.
Shapiro praises the Abraham Accords
Yeah.
as this major foreign policy victory,
Yeah,
arguing that they weaken Iran and create new opportunities for peace and prosperity in the region.
right,
But some critics worry that the Accords sideline the Palestinian issue
right.
and may actually make a two-state solution even more difficult to achieve. It's still too early to say what the long-term impact of the Abraham Accords will be.
Right,
They have undoubtedly shifted the geopolitical landscape,
right,
but whether they will lead to a more peaceful and just future
right.
for both Israelis and Palestinians remains to be seen.
It's a lot to process,
It is.
and it's clear there are no easy answers.
There aren't.
We've gone from ancient history to modern-day geopolitics, and the conflict seems as complex and intractable as ever.
And what's important is that you continue to engage with this issue,
Yeah,
to seek out diverse perspectives,
right,
and to resist simplistic narratives.
right.
There's a lot of information out there,
Yeah,
and it's easy to get overwhelmed or to fall into that trap of seeing things in black and white.
so what should we take away from all of this? Is there any hope for a lasting peace?
Peace is always possible,
Yeah,
but it requires empathy,
right.
understanding,
Yeah.
and a willingness to compromise. It also requires acknowledging those historical grievances and traumas
Right.
that continue to shape the present.
It sounds like we're being encouraged to embrace the complexity and resist the urge to oversimplify.
Exactly. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a human story.
Yeah,
It's a tragedy that's been unfolding for generations.
right.
It's a story of lost displacement, fear, and anger,
Yeah,
but it's also a story of resilience,
right.
hope, and the enduring human desire for freedom and dignity.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about.
I hope so.
This deep dive has been a journey through history, politics, and human experience.
It really has.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And remember, this is just a starting point.
It is.
There's so much more to explore.
Oh, yeah.
So many voices to listen to.
Absolutely.
Keep asking questions.
Keep learning.
Keep learning and keep searching for those elusive paths to peace.
Yeah, I like that.
Until next time, keep diving deep.